V6 or i4, which Lotus Emira should you buy? This is a 2025 Lotus Emira V6 with a 6-speed manual transmission, and this is the base, as you can tell from the different wheels. This is not a first edition, but we're comparing it against a 2025 Emira Turbo, which is a first edition, and that one has the AMG inline-4 turbo with a DCT. Now, for those who don't know, I actually own a 2024 Lotus Emira first edition with the Toyota 2GR FE Supercharged V6. That's a 3.5 liter V6, making 400 horsepower, 310 pound-feet of torque, just like in this car, although mine has the sport suspension and slightly different options, but the biggest difference is going to be the suspension, which here is touring suspension, and I got sport suspension, and also the wheels. These are the base wheels, which I think still look pretty sharp, but if you get the first edition upgraded diamond cut wheels, those are forged. They save 6 to 7 pounds per corner, which is absolutely massive. So I'm actually curious to see how that changes the driving dynamics. The MSRP of this base, as optioned, is $105,000, which is a little bit more than the i4 Turbo, but I mean, when it comes to like a 5% difference or less, I think you're gonna choose a car based on the pros and cons of the engine and the transmission rather than the actual cost. Again, we have the touring suspension and the Eagle F1 Super Sport tires. Base audio, no upgraded KEF audio system. And the only mod that the owner, Mike, has done is a third cat delete, so the car will sound a little bit louder, although he is planning a JB4 piggyback and would love to review that next once he's installed that, because I'm considering doing the same in my Emira. Now, coming to the interior, he opted for the black leather Alcantara with yellow stitching, which I was actually considering for my Lotus Emira. If I did a Seneca blue exterior, I was gonna do this interior. But one thing to keep in mind, the high touch point right here, where you actually close the door, this handle is wrapped in Alcantara, and I don't think that's gonna wear quite well. But Mike was smart to have a leather steering wheel because Alcantara feels great, especially when you're on track with gloves. But if you're doing touring suspension, you're not taking this on track, and it's not gonna wear quite as well. I love the theater of having to lift that before you press the start button. 6-speed manual transmission. Each Lotus Emira with a 6-speed feels a little bit different because the QC and the consistency just isn't quite there. We're gonna start in Sport. Now, this car does not have adaptive dampers. You're choosing either the touring or the sport suspension from factory fixed dampers, and these different modes are just gonna change things like the throttle response, the exhaust valve, and of course, traction. I also love with the V6, we have these exposed shifter linkages down here, super special touch. And also with the V6, you can see the supercharger bypass valve here in the rear view, which is also a very nice touch. I already like that sound difference. The stock V6 is a little bit quiet. Oh man, with that third cat delete, it sounds excellent. Steering is phenomenal. Hydraulic power assist, of course. The Tour suspension is immediately noticeable. Now, I have reviewed one on the street against an Emira with the sport suspension. And on the street, you can notice there's a little bit less immediacy, but on a bumpy canyon road like this, the compliance is very much welcome. It very much feels like an Evora that has that softer suspension where you can feel each wheel move independently up and down. It's a very enjoyable feeling. Not quite like the 750S, that had incredible chassis rigidity and full movement was at just each wheel, the suspension arm, right? But here you still have pretty good chassis rigidity because, of course, Lotus pioneered this bonded extrusion aluminum chassis. We have double wishbone in all four corners, weighing in around 3,200 pounds, a little bit heavier, about 100 pounds heavier than the Evora that came before. Wow, the steering just chattering away, even with these Eagle F1 Supersport tires. Heel toe is a cinch. Now you do have a little bit less immediacy to the inputs versus the Sport Emira. I'm thinking about, mine, which is also stock. But you get such great road compliance and comfort. So you can't really knock someone for getting this rather than the sport suspension. They're both valid. Do you want a little bit more sharpness to your driving dynamics? Or do you want a little bit more comfort? That massive lip spoiler the owner added to the rear also blocks a lot of your visibility, which is hilarious. 6,800 RPM red line. With some other tunes that are coming out, it sounds like we're going to be able to raise that back to 7,000 like in the Evora GT, and possibly even up to 7,200, which would be amazing, because one of the issues I have with this car is that just as it starts getting good, the red line surprises you, and there's very much a learning curve there. Such great etiquette. We'll now go down into track mode. Changes the dash. As an Emira owner myself, I do wish it had analog gauges. I think that's going to be far more timeless and age better. However, just about every manufacturer is going for a full digital dash, so I'm sure that if they did not, people would be complaining about it feeling too ancient. With the V6, we also have an LSD, unlike in the i4, which is open diff only. Now the weight distribution on the V6 is 3961. So as I'm going through these lower speed corners, you have to be extra mindful about patience, because just like a 911, it actually has a weight distribution closer to a 911 than to a Porsche Cayman, which is 45-55 front to rear. It'll otherwise give way to understeer quite readily. And you can elicit that, at least the front end getting a little bit light and just giving you a hint of push, even on street and even at street speeds. Now in terms of just raw performance, that's going to bother a lot of people, because this car at a little bit over $100,000, the performance isn't quite there compared to other cars at similar and even lower price brackets. But the level of communication you get from this car is just phenomenal. Absolutely phenomenal. And I think the driving experience is far more important than the actual spec sheet and lap times. Incredible steering, great chassis feel, excellent calibration to all the inputs, including the pedals. Transmission here actually feels better than in my car. It feels a little bit tighter, a little bit more crisp as you get from gate to neutral. There is variation between the Emiras, and you can actually adjust it yourself. You have to tweak the cable linkages. The beautiful thing about the Emira having a little bit lower limits is that it makes it more engaging to drive. So you get the weight over the front axle as you're entering a corner, help the nose tuck in. It adds this level of dynamicness to the driving experience, even on street, that's really hard to get elsewhere. With the Tour suspension, I am noticing more dive and squat as you enter a corner, especially the dive. You feel that. And it's not necessarily a bad thing. If you're trying to push the car harder in the canyons and you want that more immediacy and that level of responsiveness, then you are going to notice a difference. But it is so compliant, and it has that beautiful Lotus tuning, right, where it can handle a bumpy B road without issue. Excellent brake feel. Throttle response is also fixed from the Evora, especially before the GT. Used to have a lot of issues with, throttle mapping consistency at lower revs, but they've just absolutely solved it. Oh geez, squirrel, come on, buddy. Don't be suicidal like that. Little adrenaline junkie. Handling that big bump right there, effortless with this touring suspension. God, these cars are just so excellent for the money. You're not gonna find any other car on the market at this price point that gives you this level of communication and fun on a canyon road. It's more fun than my Miata up there. It's more fun than the Porsche Cayman GTS 4.0. You can find the comparison of an Emira versus the GTS 4.0 linked below. Now, it's hard for me to comment on how the heavier wheels actually change things because I would need to distinguish how much of that is from the suspension being softer and how much of that is the wheels being heavier. Now, I did review an Evora GT that had much heavier wheels, and that completely transformed the experience for the worse. It was far less responsive, steering feel was a lot worse. It was not how I would modify or recommend modifying a driver's car. But here, I still feel like the car is quite responsive. It has excellent steering, and I think I'll have to do a separate comparison with the base versus the forged wheels to have a definitive answer there. But now, let's hop in the i4 and see how it compares. Now it's time for the 2025 Lotus Emira Turbo. That's the i4 with the DCT. We're powered by the AMG M139 engine. That's a 2-liter inline-4 that's turbocharged, making 400 horsepower in the US. In Europe, it actually makes less. And 354 pound-feet of torque. So the same power output as the V6, but more torque, and it has a 7,200 RPM redline. It's mated to an 8-speed DCT, which is also AMG sourced. It's the same chassis, the same double wishbone front and rear. This also has touring suspension, just like the V6 we drove. And luckily, both of these Emiras are on the same tire, the Goodyear Eagle F, so that's one less variable that we need to keep track of. You can also option this with the Cup 2 tires. And this weighs around 30 to 60 pounds lighter than the V6, depending on the source. You have to know that the rear subframe was changed because of the different engine, and as a result, this inline-4, which is also transversely mounted, is lower and closer to the firewall, although it's only about 25 pounds lighter than the 2GR FE in the V6 variant. But still, the actual front to rear weight distribution is slightly changed from 39.61 in the V6 to 39.5, 60.5 in the i4. It is quicker. The 0 to 60 is about 1/10 faster compared to the V6, and the MSRP is lower by about $6,000 as well. Also, what do you guys think of this gray, this silver? This or the red? The Vivid Red is a little bit bright for me. I think the Magma Red is more my speed, but let me know what you think with a comment down below. Same interior. This has leather though, which I think over here is really important because that's otherwise going to wear not so well on the Alcantara. This has the KEF upgraded audio. That's essentially standard with any of the first edition. So the first edition is essentially maxed out in terms of options. We also have the lighter forged wheels on this, which is also standard on the first edition. Rather than a 6-speed manual transmission, we have the 7-speed DCT, and this shifter is actually the same that's in the V6 Auto, although you definitely don't want the V6 Auto. It's not a great transmission. Kind of funky. You press it forward for neutral and reverse. You go backward to get into neutral again, and then backward one more time to get into drive. And then if you want to go into manual shifting, you go left and right, which is up and down, which is, I've never seen shifting go side to side on the actual gear shift, but there's a first for everything. We're gonna go into sport mode. First impression, incredible steering, and this has electro-hydraulic steering. So it's not a hydraulic pump powered by the engine, but rather an electric motor that powers the hydraulic system. It still feels excellent. Slightly, any changes, how much of that is going to be the difference between the hydraulic versus electro-hydraulic versus the actual tires. So keep that in mind. But it feels very similar. The nice thing about the Mercedes engine is that you don't feel like redline comes too soon. Let's actually push this into track mode. Okay, reaching down and using this sideways feels so unnatural. I'm gonna stick to the paddles. Throttle mapping here in track mode is a little bit touchy. I want to get 5%, but I'm like 0 to 10%. The nice thing is that when you go into manual mode, which you can tell because the M is white. If it's yellow, you're still in auto mode, but then you're just overriding it. See, now I'm back into A for automatic, and it'll automatically shift for me. And then if I go into paddles, it'll be this yellow M. And if I go upshift like that, now it's in, I guess it didn't upshift, but I pushed it to the right, and now it went into manual mode. Now the actual throws of these paddles, they're very mushy, and it's like a short but mushy throw. I wish it was crisp and a little bit more modern. Front end feeling incredibly sharp. Suspension here is the big difference actually, because the V6 with Touring suspension, it feels a little bit too soft for what the car is. I mean, if you really want to prioritize comfort, I get it. I think the V6 Sport already is a very comfortable suspension setup that is still a little bit too soft for track, but it's just right for the street. This inline 4 with the Tour suspension feels like the V6 with Sport. Let me give you a pull first. You really got to make sure you hit the paddle a good half second before you hit redline, otherwise it's going to give you that soft limiter. But this car already feels so much more responsive. It feels more similar to my V6 with the Sport suspension rather than that V6 with the Tour suspension. And I think that's the right call, because this already still has a great deal of comfort. You can feel each quarter the suspension doing its work. It's not too stiff. Now the Emira Turbo with the Sport suspension feels a little bit too stiff, and you can watch the review of that white one, also from Boardwalk Lotus, linked below. Throttle is bugging me a little bit as I'm trying to modulate mid-corner. The shifts are substantially slower than what I would want though. I'm accentuating with my hands so you can see how long it takes. And this is track mode too. It rejected that. You don't have the Porsche PDK that's gonna let you push near redline on downshifts. Also, not quite getting the rotation I want because there's no LSD here. It's an open diff. It uses brake vectoring in the rear. Yeah, see these shifts they're smooth, but they're just far slower than what you should have in a modern DCT. Now compared to that V6 with the Tour suspension, you're not having to manage the weight transfer quite as mindfully. This follows your command a bit more naturally, and part of that is going to be the stiffer suspension, and part of that is also going to be slightly lower weight and slightly more neutral weight distribution front to rear, and also lower center of gravity. So small little tweaks, but overall you notice the difference. Whereas with that V6, it almost acts like a 997 Porsche at times, where you need to really be patient, let the front end grip, be patient as you get on the throttle as well, corner exit. And again, that's part of the fun when you're driving a 911 or even an Emira that it has a pretty biased front to rear weight distribution. But when it's too much, it can actually be frustrating. And again, the V6 Tour, I think, is very comfortable on a road like this, but you're paying a price of the responsiveness that after getting to this i4, you realize this is the right balance. Again, this feels very similar to my V6 Sport, because it's still beautifully compliant, but you have more immediacy. You don't have to wait a split second for the front end to respond after you turn the wheel. And when you're braking, you're not getting as much dive. When you're accelerating, not getting as much squat. The whole body control equation, body control versus comfort, is always a trade-off, and you want to strike the proper balance based on the vehicle and the intended use case. And I think this actually strikes it much better than that V6 with Tour. Back, auto, first. Substantially quicker than the V6. Now, one thing I also was bothered by a little bit in the V6 Emira, granted I've gotten used to this over time, is that the brake pedal, when you're driving it hard and you need to push on the brakes harder, it feels phenomenal. Great feel, great modulation, high resolution, but at lower speeds, if you're trying to heel toe when you're puttering around town, which by the way is totally fine and valid, and for those who are saying that you should not heel toe when driving around town, you're wrong, and I'll talk more about that in some other videos. But when you're trying to heel toe in the Emira with the V6, you can notice that the brake pedal is not totally linear. It tends to be pretty grabby when you're driving at low speeds, and you have to get hard into it for it to feel more natural. Whereas Porsche's inputs are second to none. Like they are so one-to-one, there's no learning curve. But here, because you're not heel toeing, this is a DCT, there's no third pedal, the brakes, they don't bother you. They still have that great feel, and especially when you're getting into it, great modulation. But when I'm driving the car slower and less aggressively, the brakes don't bother me here, which is, you know, a trade-off with DCT. So overall, should you get the V6 Tour or the Turbo Tour? I like aspects of both cars. I think the actual exposed shifter linkage, the engagement with the manual transmission, seeing the supercharger bypass valve in your rear view is all very special with the V6. However, you can feel the higher center of gravity both in the Sport as well as in the Tour, and there's slightly more weight, again 30 to 60 pounds, and a little bit more of an extreme front to rear weight distribution. However, the engine in that car feels far more appropriate in my opinion. The one main downside is that the redline of 6800 feels a bit premature, but it's a far more linear engine. It sounds far more appropriate. The turbocharged nature of this car is very much front and center. You feel the lag, especially even once you get past the turbo threshold. A lot of people are focused on turbo lag way down low, 2,000, 3,000, 4,000. You have to get past the turbo threshold in each car, and then you want to talk about lag. Otherwise, you're just not at threshold. And here you're still feeling a bit of that lag because they're pushing so much power. It's a very boosted 2-liter engine to make that level of output. So the powertrain here wouldn't be my first pick. The DCT isn't sharp enough. The engine lag, the lack of immediacy, and also just the sound and the turbo noises, it doesn't fit, in my opinion, the ethos and what I imagine the Emira to be. Although those who argue that this is a baby McLaren, a baby supercar, would say that, hey, McLarens are all turbocharged, and this feels like a baby McLaren in that regard. So yeah, in summary, I wish I could take the chassis balance and the lower center of gravity and some of those benefits here, but then the powertrain from the V6, and that would be the perfect Emira. But you can't, you gotta choose one or the other. Which one would you pick? Leave a comment down below. Shout out to the owner, Mike, and also Boardwalk Lotus for letting me review their cars. Much love, my friends, and I'll see you all in that next one.